What happens when the original manuscript of an ancient book disappears? Does the history contained in that manuscript disappears too? What if the oldest physical copy that survives today was produced decades or even centuries after the person or even event it describes?
Find any reference to this man named Muhammad in the 7th century? This is the first guy that ever wrote down his biography, and he died in 833. 833? Muhammad died in 632. Do you see a problem, folks?
Should historians conclude that everything inside that manuscript was invented when the surviving copy was made? Because if we consistently applied that principle, we could create serious problems for Greek history, Roman history, biblical history, and Islamic history. And this distinction lies at the heart of one of the most controversial modern challenges to the history of early Islam. Now, this is the challenge. Where is the original biography of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him? Where is Ibn Ishaq's manuscript? And why do major surviving Hadith collections appear generations after Prophet Muhammad? And why were the scholars such as al-Bukhari working far from Mecca and Medina? These are legitimate historical questions. There is another question that must come first. What would the absence of an original manuscript actually prove? The methodological point is basic manuscript history. The disappearance of author's autograph proves that the autograph no longer survives. It does not by itself prove that the work never existed. Now, apply the distinction to Prophet Muhammad's biography. Sometimes the argument is presented like this. Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, died in 632. Ibn Hisham died around 833. Therefore, Prophet Muhammad's biography suddenly appeared 2 centuries after Prophet Muhammad's lifetime.
Down is this guy, Ibn Ishaq. Last possible time they could have written something down. 765.
But Ibn Hisham was not claiming to invent Prophet Muhammad's biography. He was transmitting and editing an earlier work associated with Muhammad bin Ibn Ishaq, who died around 767. We do not possess Ibn Ishaq's autograph. That matters. But the historical question is not simply, where is Ibn Ishaq's handwriting? It is, can earlier material preserved through later recensions and quotations be historically investigated? Historians routinely ask exactly that question about lost works from antiquity. This does not make every Sira story authentic. It means the date of Ibn Hisham's surviving textual tradition cannot automatically be treated as the birth date of the tradition inside it. The same problem appears in discussion of Hadith.
I have no doubt that there was Bukhari or Muslim or Dawud or Tirmidhi. These guys did exist. But why is it we don't have the original copies? 9th century, they're written on parchment, they're in caliphal courts.
Al-Bukhari died in 870. He came from Bukhara in Central Asia. That sounds extremely late if we imagine that Muslims waited until Bukhari before recording anything about Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. But Bukhari was not the beginning. Before Bukhari was Imam Malik ibn Anas. Imam Malik lived and taught in Medina. His Muwatta contains prophetic reports from the companions and successors, legal materials and traditions associated with Medinan practice. And the history does not suddenly begin with Imam Malik either. Early Islamic transmissions involved a mixture of teachings, memorization, written notes, and increasingly organized collections. The great canonical Hadith collections represent an important later stage of selection and organization. They do not represent the moment Muslims first began transmitting information about Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him.
Look what happens to oral tradition. I tell her something, she tells him, he tells him. By the time it gets back to me, after 15 minutes, it's 2 different comments.
Technology is intuitive. Tell one person something, they tell another, then another, eventually the message changes. Now imagine 200 years. But the knowledge becomes misleading if it is treated as a description of the entire Hadith transmission system. Hadith literature claims named teachers, named students, parallel transmitters, geographically separate teaching centers, different versions of the same report, and written material alongside oral instructions. None of this makes error impossible. It certainly does not make fabrication impossible. Muslim scholars themselves discussed fabricated reports. But this is a transmission network, not simply 15 anonymous people whispering one sentence around a room. This brings us to a crucial historical question. If a tradition survives in a later collection, Does that mean the tradition itself originated at the time that collection was written? Or, to put it more precisely, can earlier material preserved through later recensions and quotations be historically investigated? Modern historical scholarship says that in principle it can. And Hadith research provides an important example. In 2026, Saifuddin Kara published a peer-reviewed study in Oxford's Journal of Islamic Studies titled Debating the Origins, the Sanctity of Medina in Hadith Narratives. Kara examined traditions in which the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, is reported to have declared Medina a sacred territory. But instead of simply accepting these reports because Muslim traditions consider them authentic or rejecting them because they survive in later collection, Kara applied a historical method known as Isnād-cum-matn analysis. The idea is relatively simple. Researchers gather different versions of the same tradition. They compare the isnad, the chains, identifying who transmitted the report. Then they compare the matn, the actual wording of those reports. If particular versions of the text consistently correspond to particular branches of transmission, scholars can investigate how the tradition developed and whether an earlier form lies behind the later surviving versions. And Kara's conclusion is significant. His analysis argues that behind the different versions concerning the sanctity of Medina lies an earlier historical core. Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, declared Medina sacred and indicated the boundaries of its sacred territory. Interestingly, these reports are not identical. They contain variations, but variation does not automatically mean fabrication. In some circumstances, different transmission branches preserving a common core may actually provide evidence that the shared material existed before the later collection in which those variations or versions survive. And this method does not always produce an answer favorable to traditional Muslim claims. In another peer-reviewed study, researchers applied Isnād-cum-matn analysis to traditions concerning the Prophet's flag. They concluded that the particular phrase describing the Tawheed inscription on the flag was probably a later addition. That distinction is extremely important. Historical criticism does not require us to say every hadith is authentic, nor does it justify saying every hadith is late. Instead, individual traditions must be investigated on their own evidence. And this exposes the problem with a simple 200 years later argument. If Bukhari compiled his Sahih generations after Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, that tells us the approximate period in which al-Bukhari's collections took its final form. It does not by itself establish when every individual tradition inside that collection originated. Those are two different historical questions. The same principle applies elsewhere in ancient history. Historians routinely investigate earlier material preserved in later manuscripts, quotations, recensions, and compilations. So the relevant question is not simply how late is our surviving book. The real question is how early can the material preserved within that book be historically traced? And once we make that distinction, the debate changes, because the date of the preservation is not necessarily the date of origin. A later collection can preserve earlier material. How much earlier? That has to be investigated tradition by tradition, and this is precisely where historical analysis should begin. There is also an anthropological problem with expecting the 7th century Arabia to behave like a modern archive. Arabian society was deeply oral. Poetry was recited, genealogies were remembered, tribal history circulated through human beings. Knowledge could be performed as well as written. And Arabia was hardly unique. Greek epic has a major oral history. Norse sagas circulated orally before many surviving literary versions were written. This does not mean oral tradition is automatically accurate. Oral traditions can change. They can accumulate legends. Political interest can also reshape memory. The point is simply that historians study oral cultures. They do not declare that those societies had no history until the earliest manuscript that happens to survive. This is where the wider historical context, emphasized by Dr. Roy Casagrande, becomes useful. Islam emerged within the world of the late antiquity. Byzantium and Persia had fought devastating wars. Arabia contained complex tribal and commercial networks. The Near East was religiously diverse, and within a remarkably short period, Arab armies transformed the political geography of the region. Casagrande is useful here for the context, but context is not manuscript evidence. For manuscripts, inscriptions, and archaeology, we must turn to the objects themselves. The Quran must also be separated from Hadith. According to traditional Islamic reports, Quranic revelations were recited, memorized, and written during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Those reports describe collection under the first Caliph, Abu Bakr, may Allah be pleased with him, and later standardization under the third Caliph, Uthman, may Allah be pleased with him. Historians can debate the details of that traditional narrative, but here something important happens. We can move from literary tradition to physical evidence. The University of Birmingham holds Quranic folios whose parchments produce a radiocarbon range of 568 to 645 CE at 95.4% probability. And precision matters here. Radiocarbon dating dates the parchment, the animal skin. It does not directly date the ink, so this does not prove that the manuscript was written in a particular year, but it places the physical material extraordinarily close to Islam's earliest period. The same historical development helps explain why tafsir becomes increasingly elaborate. Islam moved beyond Arabia into Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Persia, North Africa, and Central Asia. Millions of Muslims were eventually non-native Arabic speakers. Questions multiplied. What does this Arabic construction mean? What was the context of this verse, and how does it relate to law? Which interpretation had earlier authorities transmitted? Later systematic tafsir therefore reflects, at least partly, the needs of an expanding civilization. Its later literary development does not automatically demonstrate that 7th century Arabic speakers possessed no understanding of the Quran. But suppose we discuss the literary tradition, then put the books aside, because early Islam also left evidence in stone. One extraordinary example is the Zuhayr inscription. It is dated to 24th year after Hijrah, that is 644, and apparently refers to the death of the Caliph Umar, may Allah be pleased with him. Now what does this prove? Not every hadith about Caliph Umar, may Allah be pleased with him, not every detail of the traditional Khilafat narrative, but it demonstrates something extremely important. A 1st century Hijri chronological framework associated with Umar, may Allah be pleased with him, was being physically carved into the Arabian landscape remarkably early. This is not Bukhari. It is not Abbasid Baghdad. It is stone. And consider the Jerusalem. The dome of the rock was completed under the Umayyad Caliph Abdul Malik around 691 to 692 CE. Its monumental inscriptions employ recognizably Islamic and Quranic theological language and explicitly engage Christian claims about Jesus. Again, this does not authenticate the entire later Hadith corpus. It establishes something more fundamental. An identifiable Islamic religious discourse was materially present during the Umayyad period. And theory that makes Islam essentially an Abbasid literary invention must account for that. The same period leaves coins and administrative papyri. The earliest Arab rulers initially reused and adapted existing Byzantine and Sasanian administrative and monetary forms. Over time, the material culture became increasingly distinctive. This gradual development is historically important. Material culture does not show a complete 9th century religion appearing from nowhere. It shows political, linguistic, and religious transformation unfolding across the 7th century. Now remove every Muslim historical book. Ibn Hisham, gone. Bukhari, gone. Malik, gone. Tabari, gone. Does Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, disappear too? No. Now the early non-Islamic sources also discuss the Arab movement and in some cases, Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Some sources are ambiguous, others are more explicit. They should not all be treated as equally strong. One of the standard scholarly collections for examining this material is Robert Hoyland's Seeing Islam as Others Saw It. The important point is, early Islamic history does not depend solely upon Muslims writing about themselves centuries later. This becomes particularly interesting when we consider Patricia Crone. Crone was not a traditional Muslim historian. She became famous precisely because she challenged fundamental elements of traditional Islamic historiography. Her later discussions accepted that the evidence points toward an Arab prophetic figure in the early 7th century. The historical question is no longer simply did Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, exist? It becomes how much of the later Islamic portrait can historians trace back to that 7th century figure? That is far more interesting question. Now consider Makkah. Crone famously challenged the traditional picture of Makkah as an important center of international long-distance commerce. But watch the logical step. Traditional Makkah trade has been exaggerated. Is not identical to Makkah did not exist. A settlement can exist without being one of antiquity's major international commercial centers. And the absence of small settlement from a surviving ancient map cannot by itself prove that the settlement did not exist. So comes the consistency test. Suppose we establish this principle. If the original manuscript from the lifetime of a religious founder does not survive, the later tradition is historically worthless. Very well. Where is Moses' original Torah? We do not have it. The Dead Sea Scrolls provide extraordinarily important early witnesses to the biblical text, but they are still many centuries later than the traditional period associated with Moses. Peace and blessings be upon him. This is not an attack on Judaism or Christianity. It is precisely the opposite. Biblical scholarship demonstrates why the manuscript argument must be more sophisticated. No serious textual critic says the earliest surviving copy is from this date, therefore the entire tradition was invented on this date. Instead, scholars reconstruct textual history. The same principle applies to the Christianity. We do not possess the original handwritten manuscripts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, or Paul's original letters. And yet, the Christian scholarship does not conclude no originals, therefore no first century Christianity. It uses textual criticism. Manuscripts are compared, variants are mapped, ancient translations are examined, quotations by early Christian writers are studied, earlier form of texts are reconstructed. Here is a methodological question. Why would that possibility exist for Christianity, but be impossible in principle for Islam?
Everything we know about the man Muhammad, everything we know about the Quran, everything we know about Mecca comes from 200 to 300 years later and hundreds of miles further north. Too late and too far away.
Jay also emphasizes that large amounts of surviving Islamic scholarship come from Iraq, Syria, and Central Asia. True, but geography of preservation is not the same as the geography of the origin. After the Arab conquests, major scholarly activity naturally developed in the regions containing older urban, bureaucratic, and literary infrastructures. A tradition preserved in Baghdad does not automatically originate in Baghdad. Transmission must be traced, not assumed. If Islam was fundamentally reconstructed under Abbasids, the theory must explain the evidence that predates the Abbasid rules. It must explain early Quranic manuscript material, the Arabic inscriptions, Umayyad monumental theology, coins, papyri, external non-Muslim sources, and earlier transmission layers. Finding difficulties in the traditional account is not enough. The alternative has to explain the surviving evidence better. There is also an interesting counter question. If Persian or Abbasid scholars fundamentally created Islam, why construct its sacred origins in Western Arabia? Why make Arabic its revelatory language? Why place its sanctuary far from the centers of the Abbasid intellectual power? Why preserve stories celebrating Arab figures who preceded the Abbasids? These questions do not mathematically disprove later reconstruction, but any reconstruction theory must answer them. And there remains an enormous 7th century event that cannot be ignored. Arab armies emerged from Arabia and transformed much of the former Byzantine and Sasanian world. Persia fell. Large Byzantine territories were lost. New Arab political structures appeared. Later literature may reshape the memories of these events, but the events themselves are not the invention of Bukhari. Michael H. Hart famously ranked Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, first in the 100, his ranking of history's most influential individuals. Its relevance is simply historical scale. Whatever conclusions we reach about later Muslim literature, the civilization associated with Prophet Muhammad profoundly transformed world history. Now an important qualification. This documentary has not demonstrated that every hadith is authentic. Some hadiths are weak. Muslim scholars themselves said so. Some reports are fabricated. Again, Muslim scholars themselves have said so. Seerah traditions developed political memory influence transmission. Chronologies can be uncertain. Individual reports must be investigated. But none of those statements logically requires the conclusion that is, therefore, the entire 7th century Islamic framework was invented 200 years later. That conclusion requires evidence of its own. Ultimately, this should not be about which debater do you like. J. Smith's a Christian apologetic. Muslim speakers defend Islam. David Wood attacks Islam. Patricia Crone challenged Islamic tradition from academic historiography. Their religious commitments and intellectual assumptions differ. So remove the personalities, put the evidence on the table, and ask which explanation best accounts for it. The Birmingham parchment does not prove Bukhari. The Zuhayr inscription does not prove every story about Caliph Umar. The Dome of the Rock does not prove every element of the later Islamic theology. External chronicles do not prove every detail of the seerah, and later transmission chains do not make every hadith authentic. But together, these different categories of evidence establish something extremely important. Islam does not become first visible with Bukhari in the 9th century. Historical footprint is considerably earlier. The legitimate historical debate is not Bukhari came 200 years later, therefore Islam was invented 200 years later. It is how much of the later Islamic traditions can securely be traced back through the earlier evidence. That question deserves serious scholarship. Okay, let's move on to our conclusion now. Apply the standard consistently. Should Islam be scrutinized? Absolutely. Should historians question hadith? Yes. Should Ibn Ishaq be critically analyzed? Certainly. Should archaeology be allowed to challenge traditional Muslim claims? Of course. But historical criticism should work in both directions. If missing autographs do not automatically erase Moses, peace and blessings be upon him. If missing New Testament autographs do not automatically erase first century Christianity, and if later copies can preserve earlier Greek and Roman literature, then the absence of Ibn Ishaq's original handwritten manuscript cannot by itself prove that early Islam were invented centuries later. No lower standard for Islam, no higher standard for Islam. One historical standard. So perhaps the most useful question raised by Dr. J. Smith is not merely where is the original manuscript, but would we apply the same standard everywhere else?